I wasn't here for this one.
I know.
Yeah.
Surprise.
Rude.
What the heck? That makes it seem like I'm never here.
You're listening to The Janchi Show, hosted by 3 Korean American adoptees diving headfirst into what it means to be adopted, Korean, American, and more. And now, here's your hosts, Nathan, Patrick, and KJ.
What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of the Janchi Show. I am one of your hosts, Patrick Armstrong, here with my fellow co-hosts Nathan Nowak and KJ Roelke. How are you boys doing today?
Doing it.
Je suis.
Je suis.
Oh, we're speaking other
Bien?
languages now.
Yeah?
Is that
See.
Is that how you say
Sehr
good?
gut?
I don't know.
Yes. Yes. Sehr gut.
Sehr gut. Sehr gut.
Wait, what's that? German?
Yes,
Yeah,
German.
it's like
Nice. I can recognize it, can't say it. Well, we are the Janchi Boys, the Banquet Boys. I don't know if you told me how you were doing other than started to talk in different languages, so I'm just gonna blast forward.
we just said it's good in a lot of different
Yeah.
languages.
That's true. I'm glad that y'all are doing good. I'm
Bueno.
doing good as well.
Ciao, Bella.
We are the Janchi Show, and we are excited to be back for 2024. Nathan, for anybody joining us this year who hasn't heard the show before, what does Janchi mean?
Janchi means to feast and celebrate and banquet. And so we are feasting and celebrating amongst ourselves and with each other and with others because we have a snack or drink at the end of our show. But we
Yeah,
are
sometimes
also,
it's a drink you can snack on and a snack you can drink on.
Drink on.
God.
Yeah.
You'll never know. But we're here and we're discussing our identities and our stories.
That's true.
And our futures.
And our futures, our pasts, our
futures.
presents, and our futures with our ghosts, because it is that time of year. Well, I guess it's past that time of year, but what's up?
Not much.
I was just thinking like Lunar New Year is coming up here soon-ish, which is exciting. I should probably try to get another New Year celebration, but it's Asian going on or something. So, yeah. I don't remember if we talked about it on air last week, but Year of the Wood Dragon. So shout out to all you dragon heads out
dragons. Dragons.
Shout out to the wooded dragons out there. I don't know how fire and wood go together, but it seems to work out. It seems to work, and I'm here for
Overall
it.
positive.
Yes.
Overall net positive situation. We got a really exciting episode this week, a guest interview with the one and only Dr. Kim McKee, one that I was actually not here for. So you're not going to hear me on this episode. So I can't give you a synopsis of it because I haven't listened to it yet. But KJ and Nathan were there. They had a great conversation. Can you guys let us know what we're going to, or what we should expect from this conversation y'all had?
It's a good conversation. This is a unique situation because I think, and I've had lots of time to research this, and classic KJ didn't do any research prior to the show. But I think that this is our first official returning guest where it's not a part 2. It's not a, whatever
Special,
continuation.
appearance.
Whatever. We're like someone who's been on previously. I think it's like our first official first official returning guest. So that's cool. And you can listen to her first episode 69. We go over her new book, Adoption Fantasies, the Fetishization of Asian Adoptees from Girlhood to Womanhood. And we talk about it in the show, but it's really kind of examining what it means to be an Asian woman and adopted, and then an Asian adoptee and female presenting, with some like really key cultural references from, I think, what is it, like 1990 to 2015 or something like that? Isn't it like the window that she said? And I thought that was just such a clear, like pointed idea, because we talk about like Sex in the City, we talk about Modern Family, we talk about like, well, in her book, she talks about that. She talks about like some of the Asian stuff, the non-Asians, like just all of these things that really make up what it is to have these intersection of identities. And it was just a really good conversation chatting with her about that. I don't know, Nathan, what stood out to you about it?
I mean, there was definitely during the process of reading the book too, there's some eye-opening things that I would really highly recommend for, not just, I know we talk about that this is for women and stuff like that. But this was, KJ and I's opinion of the book as well. And so it's not just for women. And although it is, she does state that is her love letter to, adoptees, women and stuff like that. So I don't know. I personally got a lot out of it because I do have a daughter, and I also am interested in just how
are married
and are married, and I
women.
This is and I know women. This exactly. Well, I would like to understand women, I guess you could say. So, and what they've gone through, and it's a very interesting book, and I really appreciated just for her time because she was in Korea as well. And making the time to come onto our show again and tell us a little bit about the book. So,
well, I'm excited to listen to the episode. Dr. McKee, somebody I've learned a lot from, Disrupting Kinship, one of my 4, now 5, but that's a spoiler, key pieces of resource and literature when it comes to Korean adoption and things like that deal with that topic. So really excited to hear you all have this discussion. Really excited to dive into the book myself. And without further ado, let's get to it.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Janchi Show interview portion. Today, we have a very special returning guest, Dr. Kim McKee.
Ooh.
Kim, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. It's really nice to be back here. Thank you.
Well, it's great to have you on again. It's great to have you calling in from South Korea, which is not the case when we talked almost directly 2 years ago as of this recording. So when we last talked, listeners, you can go back to episode 69 to find that. You don't have to scroll a while. It was December of 2021. And you had wrapped up Disrupting Kinship, and we're talking about that. And Patrick was very excited to talk to you because he was like, oh yeah, I've read the book. This is going to be great. And it was a great conversation. But what have you done briefly in the intervening 2 periods, and how have you ended up across the ocean?
Well, how I ended up across the ocean is
I assume by plane.
Yes, I did fly here. It was nice. I did not have to take a boat.
Swam, okay?
Or swim. I hope not. But no. So I'm here as a U.S. Fulbright scholar. So I am teaching faculty at Sogang University. So I was here this past fall. We came in August of 2023, but the semester didn't start till September. And I'm just finishing up this semester this week, actually. This is the final exam period. And so then I have to grade, and then grades will be due. And then we'll be staying through the beginning of 2024. So it's pretty cool. It's one U.S. academic year, but because of how the Korean academic year structures itself, I'm joining them for their next academic year, which will be fun. And so classes will start in March. And so in 2021, I ended up applying for the Fulbright in fall of 2022, and I was notified that I received it earlier this past year. And it's quite exciting. So I'm here. My son is with me. And then my husband comes back and forth between our home and outside of Chicago and then to Seoul. And so it's been really great. And you asked me what else I've done besides just coming to Korea. So one of the things that has happened recently as I finished my second book, Adoption Fantasies, The Fetishization of Asian Adoptees from Girlhood to Womanhood. And so that I was working on that when I last talked to you. And then that's kind of really been my focus within the past, 2 years. And so it's been really cool to have that book come out while I'm in Korea. And so now I've been thinking a lot more, though, about adoptees' fantasies around adoption and return. I've also been thinking a lot about kinship and motherhood and what it means to be in Korea as a parent, as opposed to the other times that I've come to Korea and negotiated, like just being an adoptee in Seoul and other parts.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, yeah, I'm super excited to have you on to talk about your book. And I wanted to just highlight a couple of things that I think are really interesting as I was reading through it. So in, I think it's chapter 2 or chapter 3, there's just one line, it's kind of it's not a throwaway line. It's literally the beginning of a paragraph. But to me, it was just like, yeah, this is interesting. So you write, perhaps adoptees were never supposed to grow up. And that's something that we talk about on the show. And I know that a lot of scholars and people kind of in the community even talk about the idea of being perennially infants and those kinds of things. And at the same time, we've got your book blurb, which a little bit says, and the pertinent part here is, McKee traces the life cycle of the adopted Asian woman from the rendering of an infant adoptee body in white U.S. imaginary to Asian American fantasies of adoption to encounters with the hypersexualization of Asian and Asian American women and girls in the U.S. popular culture. So I really like that your book is like, well, what if adoptees do grow up? Even though maybe we were never supposed to grow up, what happens if they do, and how do they wrestle with that? So for the listener, can you provide kind of a broad overview of what your new book is about? And I really am excited to talk to you about it, because as I was re-listening to our previous episode, you had just hinted at like, I'm like working on this idea. I'm like tinkering around with it. I think I've got it, whatever. And so it's really, really exciting to have you back on. And it's like, oh, this is directly, you could go one to the other and it would be like no time has passed except for 2 years.
Well, and then if you think about how, I don't know, for me, time, I can't believe it's already 2024 or going to be 2024. So time feels very relative, right? And so, oh gosh. So when I think about what this book is doing, I'm looking at how adoption is depicted in popular culture. So thinking about both documentary and real life examples, as well as fictional television and film examples, in part because U.S. popular culture tells us so much about adoption. It demonstrates how kind of everyday Americans are conceiving adoption and the kinds of messages that they're engaged with. And so I think a lot about, and I think I have a line about this in the book, or at least an end note, that I was surprised, and this is when I was wrapping up my page proofs and copy edits over this past summer, to discover that The Blind Side, right, was one of Netflix's, I think it was the most popular DVD movie, maybe not stream, but back when Netflix did like DVDs.
Yeah, back when you're still renting DVDs.
Yeah, when they would mail them to you. And I'm sure for many of your listeners, they followed sort of what happened with the Tuohys and Michael Orr in real life, right? Mm-hmm. But for me, knowing that, it says so much about our country, that a movie about a white woman, quote unquote, saving, a Black teenager is the most kind of sought after, downloaded, watched, rented, I don't know, whatever word we're using to describe what Netflix has done and is doing, film, right?
Yeah.
And so that really stuck with me. But to get to what the book is actually focused about, I'm looking at the way the adopted Asian girl and woman circulates in the U.S. popular cultural imaginary from 1992 to 2015. And so I was intentional about selecting 1992 because I start and I look at Woody Allen, Soon-Yi Previn, and Mia Farrow. And for those who are the uninitiated in terms of who any of those figures are, the actress Mia Farrow adopted Soon-Yi Previn when Soon-Yi was a young girl, and she, is her adoptive mother. Farrow was in a relationship with Allen, but then in 1992, it came out to light that Allen and Previn were engaged in a relationship. They have since married. And so I kind of think about how Farrow's reaction to what happened to her daughter, Soon-Yi, exemplifies some of the concerns and demonstrates like the limits to adoptive families, especially thinking about what love looks like. And this is especially true when you start looking at and listening to how Farrow described and describes currently Soon-Yi Previn in comparison to her other children, both adopted and non-adopted. I also look at Modern Family, Sex and the City, the film Soul Searching. I look at the documentary Twinsters. I look at some early indie mainstream films, Sideways and Better Luck Tomorrow. And so I look at a range of media to really understand how that infant body, as seen in Modern Family and Sex and the City, evolves. So thinking about adolescence, young adulthood, what does it mean when adoptees are not with their white adoptive parents and we're just seen as just another Asian or Asian American woman? And I think about, too, how do Asian American cultural producers traffic in fantasies of adoption, because Asian Americans also have their own notions of what adoption is, just like white folks, right? And then I finally turn a lens to think about how adoptees have internalized those messages and what are adoptees doing to kind of engage those fantasies and as well as push back against those.
Yeah, that was very interesting. When you started off the book with the Modern Family and the Sex and the City, I actually didn't ever watch Sex and the City. Not a big surprise there, but the fact that I didn't know that they had an adoption storyline in that, and that I did watch Modern Family though, and that the name of the girl was the same. Both were Lily, which I thought was very interesting. I don't know how coincidental that is, but just hearing how you described the incidents from those storylines, I was like, oh, I never thought of it that way. I wasn't looking at it like that through my, because back then I was still in the fog of sorts, and I wasn't looking at it at the adoption story the way that I would look at it now and the way that you kind of describe it in the book. So that was a very interesting kind of revelation for me. And on top of that, I also had some other revelations during the reading some of your book, and also relating to a lot of the things that you said, even when you put those little inserts of quotes throughout the book. When you there's like, I'm looking at one right now that says, "I don't see you as Asian, I see you as my child." And I don't know how many times my parents have actually said that to me as well. And, you go through kind of more of a history of adoption and other types of microaggressions that we may have received, or things that we as adoptees kind of run into in everyday life. So I found that very interesting. And then lastly, I found one key thing very interesting too, that I didn't expect, when you started talking about how adoption was legalized 20 some years before interracial marriage was. That kind of blew me away. I didn't actually ever realize that was a thing, that was legal, but yet you couldn't have married, but yet you could adopt a child. So
I think a lot about that, because I think when you understand when the first transracial adoptions are sort of been documented to happen, right, in 1948 in Minnesota. And then when you think about Loving v. Virginia in 1967, right, it says so much about who we are as a country, and what the U.S. is invested in around notions of child saving and rescue. Next semester, I'm super excited. I'm teaching this class, a special topics class called Forced Separation and Rescue, for the Department of American Culture at Sogang. And so all of this kind of in my mind is so overlapping to really, think concretely about how adoption needs to be understood through a lens of white supremacy, anti-Blackness, settler colonialism, imperialism, militarism, because it tells you a story about who people think they are, and their professed beliefs, and how those professed beliefs sometimes don't line up with kind of other aspects of their identity. I have another essay that's going to come out next year in a volume on global anti-Asian racisms that Jennifer Ho is editing. And that essay, part of the title is The Anti-Asian Racism at Home. And it really looks at how one of adoptees' earliest encounters with anti-Asian racism and microaggressions is either within the family or within the white communities that are professed to be these safe environments for them. And I know not all Asian adoptees or adoptees of color are adopted into white families, but given how the majority of us are, and I think anecdotally when you talk to adoptees, and some of your guests have shared this too, right? We all have those experiences, and we all know those experiences so intimately. And so I think for me, as I was writing, especially about Modern Family and Sex and the City, and some of the interactions, we know those experiences. We've had those experiences. And for many of us, we've kind of just laughed it off, because it's easier to do that than really sit with it sometimes. And I think it's easy to cast kind of this retrospective eye, being like, oh yeah, that happened. But when you're in the moment, depending on your age and where you are in terms of your adoptee consciousness, it may not even track for you. I have a story, I guess that you could call it a story, in Adoption Fantasies, where I recall in high school, a classmate of mine. It started in our Spanish class. She started calling me Janet, like Janet in the real world Seattle. And I never it never bothered me enough to be like, oh, why are you doing that? That's really racist. But like now as an adult, I'm like, oh gosh, I'm horrified for myself, right? What does it mean where something like that doesn't even kind of register? Because that says so much about the communities in which we were growing up in.
You talked a little bit about that, like silence is a safety cushion or blanket. And that happened to me many times, or in my personal life, it was making a joke or laughing with them about it, even though I may not have liked what was being said. It just was like, it was just so much easier to do that than to address it or to, to say anything. And so it's sad when I think about some of the instances where I've done that.
Well, and it's so interesting for me too, because I I don't have a good racism radar, I guess, if that makes sense. In the like, I am only now developing that skill to be like, yo, that stems from a racist like foundation, even if the thing that you say is not overtly harmful, right? So you talk about in chapter 1, like, oh, there's my little fortune cookie, or whatever, like referring to an Asian baby. And I was like, oh yeah, wait, that's weird. What if we called all? And I tried to create like an analog for white babies. I was like, here's my little tub of mayo. I don't know. I don't know what the I don't know what the white baby equivalent is. I just always equate white people and mayonnaise, for better or for worse. But it was just like, it's just one of those things that I think what's so interesting about this book as I'm reading through it, and I posted on Threads about it. It was I'm real dumb, and reading this, I was like, oh yeah, right. Like I think I'm smart, and then I just like immediately was humbled. But more than that, it helped me re-engage with the sense of specifically like female bodies and the way that they move through the world, and just my immense ignorance of that. And we talk about on the show, like the three of us as hosts are very like conscious of like being males and being cisgendered and heterosexual males on top of that. But like it just was it's so interesting to be able to read this. And I love that you have used so many different points of view of pop culture, right? And specifically, I just was reading through, I think it's chapter 2, where you're talking through like, what does it look like to examine just Asian female bodies outside of the scope of adoption, because that is invisible. If you're outside of the umbrella of that. I'm curious, was there anything in your research and in your writing that came as a surprise to you, or did anything change as you were writing this, or are you just like, nah, this is all stuff that I know, and now I have the research to back it up and just like put it out there into the world?
Like I say, I think in the introduction, this is my love letter to other Asian adopted women and girls, and other adoptees too, don't get me wrong.
Yeah.
But there is something that has been so meaningful for me when I hear from other Asian adopted women, especially, that the book has resonated with them on multiple levels, because a lot of the examples that I provide, both kind of in pop culture, but then when I share sort of my own experiences, they've had something similar happen to them. And I have been thinking about this book since graduate school. That's when I first started thinking about Sunyi Previn and how she demonstrates the limits of multiculturalism and colorblind love in the family. I mean, we all knew that those concepts were faulty, but like then she really exemplifies that, right? And what happened to her. And so this is something I've been wrestling with and interrogating for a while. And because of that, it's not that as I was writing it, something new happened. I think for me, especially in chapter 2, is really demonstrating and connecting those threads that highlight the fact that Asian adopted women and girls are Asian women and girls, are Asian American women and girls. And we know that, and we recognize that through our interactions, especially with our white fathers or our in-laws or brothers, etc. But I think for so many people, it's very hard to confront that because then you're forced to see that your kinship ties may not be legible. And that goes against everything, a lot of adoptive families were trying to construct, especially when the majority of us were coming of age in the 80s, 90s, early 2000s, right? Because of when you think about when the peaks of international adoption were happening. And so the reason, too, why I focus on 92 to 2015 is because it aligns with when the majority of Korean adoptees were coming of age. It aligns with what was going on with Operation Baby Lift and those Vietnamese children, as well as thinking about the rise of adoptions from China, right? So you have this kind of tipping point to really start reflecting on some of these issues. This isn't obviously to say we know international adoption from Asian countries was going on much longer. We know that transracial adoptees are grandparents, if not, parents, or I suppose one could be great grandparents, et cetera. But there's a moment that's happening now, I think, too, because of how technology has really shaped interactions, as well as thinking about pop culture's hold on how people understand race, how people understand adoption, how people understand family, kinship, etc. That to study this is, for me at least, was really meant to contribute to a broader dialogue that I think that has been occurring, but really trying to confront then how are white Americans and Asian Americans complicit in sometimes similar and sometimes divergent understandings of adoption, and what does that mean? So I think a lot about how for a lot of Asian Americans, sometimes adoptees are used as a vehicle to think about racial self-loathing and contradictions to identity without necessarily attending to the violences of adoption. So it's easy to imagine, like, what does it mean to have kind of adoption? But when you don't fully understand the ramifications or the reasons fueling that adoption, it can sometimes be simplistic, or you kind of then are a recipient of somebody's pity or assumed to be inherently melancholic in missing something because you don't have Asian parents raising you.
Something I think is appropriate too for the timing of this, your book and next year's con. For the listeners, you were the first assistant director of con when, I guess, so many years ago. And now next year's conference, Korean Adoptee Conference or Adoptee Conference, is focusing on representation and visibility, which in a way I feel is really coming out of your book a lot of, that you talk about specifically. Were you excited when you heard that that's what our subject or theme was going to be next year? And are there things that you think that your book, how am I phrasing this? How are those related? How are things in the media being represented at the moment? Because you talk about it in the book, but for the people who haven't read the book yet, can you discuss that a little more, other than the modern family and the...
Oh, definitely. I really love the community that Con has created and continues to build over the years. So I first became involved in Con. Oh goodness. My first con was in 2007 and I just attended. And then my involvement kind of ebbed and flowed. I joined the advisory council. And then it was when I was coordinating the return to Minneapolis for the second time in 2014. Stacy Schroeder, who was the second executive director, invited me to become assistant director secretary. And so that was a position that I had from 2014 to 2020. And so I was helping bring on and transition Katie Bozek into that role. So, it's been a privilege to be part of the con community. I think for me, when I think about the con CFP, as well as just broader understandings of representation and visibility, I think about how much has changed, right? But I think about how much has stayed the same. And so for me, a lot of it, and I mention it briefly in the book, right, in the coda about Joyride. I think a lot about Shannon Gibney and Nicole Chung's edited anthology of 15 adoptee authors, right? That YA anthology, When We Become Ours. I think a lot about some of the recent memoirs that have been written by adoptees that have been released. So Gibney's The Girl I Am, I Was, I Never Will Be. Jenny Hedgen Wills' book, Older Sister, Not Necessarily Related. Susan Ito's most recent book, and I see the beautiful cover, and now I'm blanking on her poor title. So my apologies, Suzanne and others, because we're seeing a shift in how our stories are being told. And what I love about When We Become Ours, because I could gush about it for hours, is that you read some of the stories, and as I was reading them, because I know Shannon, I've known her for a while, I was like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. Their story is great, right? Or I reached out to Jenny, who I've known for a long time as well, and I was like, your story is so beautiful because it captures so many things. And I think that's what people fail sometimes to understand, that there's a level of nuance and intimacy that adoptees get, and you can see it in their writing as they write about adoption. And that's absent from a lot of the stories that non-adopted people tell. I'm not saying that it's not present at all, right? I really enjoyed, for instance, David Chu's film Return to Seoul. Overall, I think there's obviously every kind of type of media, there's room to critique, but I think overall I really enjoyed the film when it came out this past year. But I also think that there's ways where we saw really great discourse and vibrant conversation. So, I think about when Joyride came out and how adoptees had varying views of the film. And I think about the work that I did with Sun Young Shin, Grace Gerloff, and Grace Newton to collaborate to create a discussion guide about the film, to really think about, you have this film and we can critique it all we want, but how can we also situate some of that plot within broader conversations to really understand what does that mean long term as we're continually to push and shift the needle of conversation. Right. And what I liked about working with Sun Young, Grace, and Grace is because we've been involved with the adoptee community broadly at different points. Right. So I think about Sun Young's work as one of the co-editors for Outsiders Within, which was just re-released 2 years ago, I believe, in 2021 by University of Minnesota Press. I think about Grace Newton's work on Red Thread Broken. She was also involved with Khan, I believe was on the advisory council for a little bit. I think about Grace Gerloff, who's also a Chinese adoptee, and her interest in thinking about adoptees' use of social media. And so for me, coming together and having that conversation with them was so helpful. In terms of other discussions of representation and adoption, for me, it's also how can we continue to recognize that we need to push the needle while also being really aware of that beautiful adoptee consciousness model that Jaron Kim, Paula O'Loughlin, Susan Bronco, Grace Newton, and others contributed toward. Because for me, that model really helps us understand that if you've been engaged in the adoptee community, that's great. But if you're also newer to the community, right, because your adoptee consciousness became activated, that sounds odd. I should be
because you became woke adoptee style,
right? But because you sort of started engaging in those kinds of ways, I want us to have a large table, and maybe table's not even the right word for it, but to think about when we have these conversations about representation, they need to be nuanced, they need to be layered. We need to lean into the gray area. Not everything is black and white. And we also don't have to agree the same way. That would be very boring. I don't want everybody to agree. But that also means that we have to have a good conversation where we can then spend time teasing out and thinking about, okay, well, why does this aspect of, say, Joyride resonate with so many? And where does the movie fall flat? Right? We can have a both and. We can also say, hey, Asian American culture producers, it's not merely enough to say, oh, we can talk to our adoptee friend. Or like I've seen interviews where Asian American culture producers like, well, I dated this girl and I was so inspired by her story, so I wanted to write about adoption. Dude, we can do better. So let's do better, because there are Asian American adoptees in the media industry. So let's use those resources. Let's reach out to adoptee scholars and adoptee activists and ask them to actually be paid consultants, right? And again, the paid part is key because labor, right? And to recognize that,
because you're worth it, adoptees.
Exactly.
Right? So, I think I'm excited about the theme. I'm bummed that I won't be back for the conference. It was nice being there last year, but because of when the Fulbright ends and when the academic calendar ends, we're not going to probably land stateside until right at the end of June. So it would be just not necessarily feasible because of when grades are due, et cetera. But yeah, no, I'm excited because I think having more conversations to thinking about representation and what we want, it is going to continue to allow us to have a more enriching discussion. And so here I also think about, so Shannon Gibney and I collaborated and we wrote about Little Fires Everywhere, both the book and the Hulu TV series, to think about what happens when the showrunner for Hulu is a domestic same-race adoptee, right? And so then we also thought about, so what does that look like in the show? But then how has that manifested in the show, as well as their intentional diverse writers' room? And what does it mean when adoption, again, is used as a plot device, right? And so what happens when people like adoption because it helps propel storylines, but they're not necessarily thinking about the adoptee as an autonomous subject with agency. And so then when we are autonomous subjects with agency, what does it look like when adoptees are writing those stories as opposed to non-adopted authors, which is why When We Become Ours is such a beautiful book, as well as some of the other works of fiction by writers who are adopted people who write about adoption.
Yeah, 100%. And what I love about your book is, for me, going back to, because my racism radar is like broken and non-existent but developing, it was so interesting to be able to read like your almost cross-examination of different like kind of pop culture representations or lack thereof of an adoption narrative. And I had the privilege of sitting in on an early table read for an adoptee-led short film project. And one of the things that's been plaguing my mind as we do the show, as we think about and really a lot of, I feel like the vocal community members right now within the Asian adoptee community that I'm aware of are like, yeah, more media representation. I'm like, my first question is like, but what does that look like for you specifically? What does it like? What are you? It's great to like push the needle for more representation, but like when you say representation, what are you actually saying? Are you just saying like you just want some adoptees present? Are you saying you want adoption to be a plot device? Are you saying you want adoption to be a backdrop to like there's so many things. And I think what was so interesting is as I'm reading through your book, as I'm in the very privileged position of learning more about a paradigm that I will never have to experience, and just a life that I'll never have to experience. I'm also just drawn to, oh man, this is, I think you highlighting Tokyo Drift of all things. And I think Justin Lin, maybe it was a different movie that he directed. It was like,
no, definitely Tokyo Drift. I really, okay. And I'm also very invested in the Fast and Furious franchise.
Great. Yeah, me too.
You also referenced
non-ironically,
Shang-Chi
but also
and Iron Man 3 too. So I was impressed.
But it was fun to be able to say like, here's a specific look at some movies where adoption isn't a thing because we know that they still affect adoptee bodies. And here's a thing where adoption is a thing, and how does that influence the character arc that the character goes through, and those kinds of things, right? And so I think it's just like being able to sit in the book and read and talk about I mean, I am not an Asian woman, and I still felt seen and loved by the book because I like so many things about things that exist in my own personal zeitgeist. I don't know if that's even an accurate use of the word, but like just in my own experience, like that I don't know where they came from, culture defining moments, like the fortune cookie example, or like the header that Nathan brought up, like I don't see you as Asian, I see you as my child, whatever, like those kinds of things, they just kind of exist in my brain. They kind of exist in all of our brains to some degree. And I think what's so interesting is through reading your book, I was able to see like, oh, this is maybe where they come from. And now I get, as you, the author, are dealing with them, I'm like, oh yeah, I wonder how I would wrestle with these things now in the privilege of being fully conscious as an adoptee, and the privilege of being mostly grown up as a 30-year-old person, I guess, mostly developed mentally, and being able to sit with that. And then it allows me then to say, oh, well, here's, as you're highlighting, like some of the tropes, some of the how adoption is told at specific moments in pop culture history, as we think about what does it mean to push forward, then I can say, oh, well, based on these tropes, your experience and your authorship, my own experience listening to other stories, maybe these are the things that we can push for. Maybe these are the ways that we can like specifically push the needle forward,
Well, I think a lot about how, and this is not related to the book, but something that I have examined is I want to say it's season 5 from the show This Is Us, right? Where it follows the Pearson family. It follows Randall Pearson and his twin white siblings, and their larger family, right? And so they use the flashbacks and they talk about present day, and then they show us the future, etc. In terms of the show, and the show has since stopped running. And I think about the show This Is Us in part because we see how by the time season 5 happens, the show that in interviews, the showrunner, Dan Fogelman, has said that they tried to be apolitical. They weren't a political show. And yet in season 5, we see how Randall, who is transracially adopted, the Black son within this white family growing up in Pennsylvania, he has this, you see him working through the adoptee consciousness model, right? You see his identity becoming his Black identity, him being more confident and having those conversations with his siblings, negotiating that with his mother, because operating in the backdrop of that season is both COVID-19 and in the wake of the 2020 protests following the murder of George Floyd, right? And so you see how this is playing out in this fictional person's life. And I think a lot about kind of the hold that television show This Is Us had on American culture for a particular time, and what that looks like and what that means. And I believe Angela Tucker, she's a Black transracial adoptee, consulted for the show, right? And so, but when I've talked to other adoptees, they're like, oh, I have not watched that. Oh, I'm glad you're watching it because, I can't watch that, right? And what does that mean too, when you have these shows that are so wildly popular and many adoptees are opting out of engaging with that show because there's so many non-adoptees then opting in? And so again, where are people getting their understandings of adoption from? It's through these shows. To pretend otherwise, I think, would be disingenuous. So even as adoptees are hosting podcasts or on Instagram or on TikTok or on other social media platforms, thinking about like Blue Sky, Threads, etc., there's going to be so many folks who haven't even entered into that discourse because they don't know it exists. And so how they're coming into contact with adoption is through television shows. It's through their neighbor's cousin's daughter, who adopted, kind of thing.
Yeah.
Right. Or maybe, and so this is why you still have kids being asked to do like family tree assignments in school, even though we know that those are really troubling and problematic, right? Because people think it would be fun to unearth history of your family. And this is not just thinking about the trauma those assignments are potentially for, like the traumatic nature of those assignments for adopted people or even children of adoptees, but for other people whose family formations don't necessarily adhere to kind of the straight heteronormative family structure.
A funny story about that. I did a family tree, but I did it with my adoptive family. And so I did all the research to try to go back as far as I could and find people. And I even went as far as to find connections of third cousins and things like that, just to see, if I could find some of these people. And I found a third cousin on Facebook, and I messaged him and said, hey, I think, is your father this person whose grandfather is this person? I think I'm your third cousin. And by the way, I'm adopted. Because I was thinking that he's going to look at my photo and go, why is this Asian guy messaging me thinking that we're the same family, even though our last names are the same? I'm like, it was so weird. And I thought about that afterwards going, that was kind of that's probably really weird. And I never heard back from the person. So obviously it was either the correct person or they were just weirded out by my random DM. But all of the stuff that you talk about is I mean, it is really good in this book. One of the things I was going to ask is, are there things that you wanted to put in the book? Because I know you, like you said, you talked in the coda about Joyride, which kind of came out toward the end of all of this. Are there other things that you, because it's an ever-changing, representation, new films, Return to Seoul, it was only, a couple years ago, or was it this year, actually, I guess. Are there other things that you wanted to include but just didn't have time to include into the book?
I intentionally stopped the book in 2015 because I wanted to think both about Benson Lee's Soul Searching that came out on Netflix in 2015, as well as Twinsters, the documentary. Mm-hmm. And for me, both of those texts are doing something obviously wildly different based on genre of film and documentary, or feature film and documentary. But for me, it was also to really bookend, I think, where we're seeing a turning point in how adoptees were engaged in community and what that looks like. So I think about adoptees who may have ended up coming to the ICA gathering, or when Catch, the Chicago Korean Adoptee group, had their anniversary sort of annual convention, people referenced thinking about both Twinsters or thinking about some of the stuff that Dan Matthews has put out kind of around the same time period, if not slightly earlier, right? As they're like, oh, I didn't know this existed, and then I saw it here, right? You see that Deanne Borshalium features some parts of the gathering, but not in the same kinds of ways as you see it in some of Dan Matthews's work, as well as in Twinsters, right? And so, I think about how much has shifted since then, and it's been nearly 10 years, right, since that stuff has come out. And so for me, when I think about adoption and adoptee representation now, and what we're doing and what I'm doing with my own work, I'm more interested in thinking about how has the conversation moved so we can have more nuanced conversations about how reunion is not a fixed endpoint. We can talk about the possibilities and the doppelgangers that I know, like Shannon Gibney has talked about, Sun Young has talked about, Matthew Salesses has written about a book, explicitly invoking the doppelganger, right? And so, what happens when we start imagining something else? What happens when we also think about how European adoptees have really spearheaded a lot of activist conversations broadly around adoptee rights, both in Europe as well as in Korea? How can we situate that in conversation with some of the activism happening in the U.S. around citizenship, for instance? At the same time, I'm really conscious about how has the advent of adoptee podcasts allowed us to create our own archive. So a lot of folks talk about our records as an archive, and that is an archive. I'm not trying to dismiss it, right? But how have we also been intentional about documenting the experiences of adoptees through podcasting to create new narratives that fall outside of written text, right? So thinking about adoptees who may never write a memoir but are on a podcast and they're sharing their experiences, right? Or how are we also pushing the needle by asking for something else, for something different, for really grappling with, I think, where adoptees are in terms of having certain kinds of conversations. So I think a lot about when, with my work in Cannes, leading up to the 2016 election, we at that Cannes conference, right, we're just talking about Brexit amongst ourselves, and then we ended up having a session that I facilitated about our racist relatives and what that looks like. And it's not to say we weren't having those conversations earlier at Cannes or in other spaces, but rather, I think folks were having a different kind of conversation. It wasn't just being like, oh, white privilege and racism exist, but it's like, okay, so this is what's happening. How are you encountering these things within your family? What are the strategies you're using? I think you're seeing more people actually openly talk about estrangement, and also boundaries and what that looks like. You have kids, Nathan, but I think about too the discourse around parenting and how parenting has changed, and the emphasis on boundaries. and accepting your kids' boundaries. And I'm thinking a lot about this because I think if you're on Instagram right now, especially around the holidays, you see a lot of parenting Instagram people talking about like, that generational shift and what that looks like. And so, and I mention this only to say, because I think we're seeing that same kind of discourse change within adoption communities. And I don't think you can rush it, but I think you can see it in how folks are entering into the conversation and what they're willing to have conversations about, right? People are way more willing to proclaim, I think, certain positions that 10 years ago, 15 years ago, I don't know if we would be having the same conversation, but that's good because it's showing how we continue to evolve as a community.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And also on your point too, when you were talking about the family relations and people talking about it, just like the little things you referenced Twinsters and Sam Fuderman did a short film also on YouTube. Did you see that one about during COVID? But it was about how her like relationship with her mom and the aggressive things that she was having happen to her because she was Asian, and the COVID people were blaming China and things like that. So, but I found that very interesting because the mediums are also more available now. I mean, granted, Facebook and YouTube and all those things have been around, but I see more of that now, more short films being portrayed through different types of media or TikToks or even Instagram reels and things like that. Like you said, people are talking about it. People are trying to move that needle. And that gives me hope that things are changing. And again, to what you said, it's moving slowly. It's not going to be overnight kind of a thing. So I definitely have hope for it. And I'm happy that people like you are writing books like this, and that, that there are resources out there, more resources than I thought, or had when I was a kid.
I think a lot about how when Rosita Gonzalez and like Amanda Transfer-Woolston and the other members of Lost Daughters, that writing collective, when that Flip the Script hashtag was launched in 2014, right? I think a lot about, how have things really changed since then? Right. And what does that mean? And then to date it back further, like how have things really changed since Outsiders Within was first released in 2006? Right. And so, and even prior to that, right? Because it wasn't like adoptees weren't engaged in activism before the internet. It's rather, right. But rather thinking about how has that activism continually shifted based on the technology available? Mm-hmm. And especially now, what does it mean when we are able to create that genealogy? Because knowing that history is so important to really understand, okay, if people are like, well, why didn't we do this before? Or if people are like, well, we have done this before, this is what it looked like. It's to be able to respect and honor what has been done in the past, as well as figuring out, well, how can we leverage that or build on that or expand that now?
Yeah, well, and I think it's wild too. It reminds me of kind of like the JFK reversal. Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. It's like, ask not what activism has done for social media, but what social media has done for like those kinds of things. But like, well, yeah, they just wasn't like, even if the platform existed, people weren't thinking about it in those ways. And I think what's so interesting is when you said like, yeah, it's 20, like, I love the way that you've situated 1992 to 2015, because it feels like such a unique time to talk around the developing consciousness of adoption broadly in America, and both for the non-adopted and the adopted. And I, as you said, like, yeah, 2015, I felt like it was a nice bookend. It reminded me, just a year before 2014, Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson, Missouri. And like, had that not happened, I mean, if it wasn't him, it would be another person. And drawing the line from Michael Brown to George Floyd, drawing the line from Fresh Off the Boat launches in 2015, I think. And so then we have another like Asian American sitcom, which is the first since, again, like the 90s, really. And we have Crazy Rich Asians that launches in 2018, that leads to Shang-Chi, that leads to, like all of these kinds of things. And I really do think it is a unique kind of turning the page. And I think that there is almost a call and response between the period that you've highlighted, 92 to 2015, and the preceding 8 years, almost 9 years that we're at now. And I think that that's so interesting. I am such a big fan of the work that you are doing and your writings and things. Do you have, and I only asked this because you hinted at it in our last podcast and before we started rolling, do you have thoughts on a book number 3? And what can we get a little Janchi exclusive sneak peek? It probably is not an exclusive or a sneak peek, but of what that could be about.
And in 2 years, we'll have you back on.
So I have been thinking a lot about the fantasies adoptees hold, and specifically thinking about Korean adoptees and our fantasies about Korea. I've been thinking about how growing up we construct these imaginary worlds, what Betty Jean Lifton calls ghost kingdoms. Shannon Gibney really, and I keep referencing Shannon, she's a mixed Black transracial adoptee, and I think about how she writes in her speculative memoir. She writes about she reflects on her own life. She also reflects on sort of the imagined life of what it would have been if she remained Erin Powers, which was her name given by her biological mother, and what that would have looked like, right? And really demonstrates too that life, that idealized life, may not have been as ideal as we thought too, right? I think sometimes it's so easy to slip into being like, but it should have been better, or it would have been better, but we don't know, right? And so for me, I've been really sitting with, okay, what were the actual conditions in which we would have been operating in? What would that have looked like? How is adoption also so happenstance, right? Where, oh, you might have been sent to a different family if it wasn't for, the way the social worker felt that day, right? Or if it wasn't for some of these conditions, it wasn't
Mercury in retrograde, and that
right.
yeah,
the sun, moon, and stars aligned today, so hey, you're going to go to the U.S. And I don't mean to sound flippant, nor do I mean to say that one is better than the other, but rather I think it's for us to kind of start having that conversation as well. I think we need to be capable of having more nuanced conversations where we wrestle with the gray area, where we think about these things when we talk about fantasies, when we talk about what fantasies of returning to Korea are looking like. Because even as adoptees have been living in Korea for quite some time, so I think about those who I've met who've lived here, who have lives here, who've repatriated, right, with dual citizenship. I think about those with F4 visas. I also thinking about adoptees who may be listening who haven't made the trip back to Korea yet for a variety of reasons, or those who have made the trip and the kind of how revelationary that might have been, or maybe those who made the trip and maybe it was less revelationary. But we're all in such different points. So we also need to acknowledge those while having these simultaneous conversations. For me, and I was privileged enough to have a short essay released in the Korea Times earlier this week, where I reflect about how I'm so interested in both these fantasies as well as the mundane, the everydayness of life in Korea with my son. Because he is giving me a glimpse as he goes to his Korean daycare of what life could have been, while also recognizing the conditions in which I would have been raised would not have been the same. And obviously, this is not the 1980s.
What?
Right? I mean, I know high-waisted jeans are back, belts.
I was like, there's a lot of things that are
90s,
giving me,
right?
giving
So
me
like, I know
80s
there's like
vibes,
a certain vibe. Yeah. So, I mean, but I think for me, it's spending a lot of time thinking about what is that?
Yeah.
What is that like? What is that like for my son, who's the child of 2 adoptees? What is that like for him? Is I know he's code switching already between being at his Orenijib, his daycare, and coming home to his primarily English-speaking mother who speaks very poor, low-level Korean, right? What does that look like? I've also been thinking a lot about what does this mean in terms of how we understand kinship relations. I have been in reunion for a decade. And while I have seen like my oma and appa, this time has been really spent getting to know my yodongseng, my sister, my younger sister, more. She's visited me in the U.S. in 2018, and we've gotten to know each other, but this is different because it's such a sustained period of time. And so I'm really savoring those moments of what that means. And, I said, I don't know, maybe we were talking about this earlier before we started recording, but I've been thinking a lot about just motherhood and kinship. And obviously adoptees have been having children. Like, I'm not going to delude myself to be like, oh, I'm the newest, whatever. No,
I'm the first one.
I'm the first one to have a baby. But no, I'm more interested though in thinking about how it was Adam Chow and I mispronounced his name. I apologize. And Kevin Volmers Kevin Volmers, who had that small volume edited collection, Parenting as Adoptees, and that came out over a decade ago, right? I think about them. I think about I think Jay Ron has kind of written a little bit about this in Harlow's Monkey. I think about John Rabel, who's another transracial domestic adoptee who's written about kind of parenting, right? So there are folks who've been doing this work. For me, what I'm struck by as I'm living in Korea for this year is, what does it mean then to have my son here and witness to how difficult it was as he was first going to daycare here, right? And his transition to Korea and how it wasn't very smooth. It took about 3.5 months before, you could see him really being okay. And for me, all that has done is really honestly made me think about those adoptees who are adopted at around his age, he's 4, or older, right? Because you have all of those memories. And so, I don't know, I just am like, I can't imagine what that was like because I was an infant when I was adopted. And as a parent, it was so, he would be so upset, and I was, and he's here with me,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so, there is a tenderness there that I've been sitting with. And as I figure out what this means, like this year has been this, and we're not even through the year, right? These last 4 months have been utterly incredible. As I really think about, the possibilities, and I think a lot about how is this year going to transform him and his relationship with Korea, and his understandings of a Korean identity. Like, he just got his haircut like last week, and he wanted a bro haircut. It took me a while to figure out what a bro haircut is. And no, he's wearing one of the predominant haircuts he sees around campus, right? So we live on campus at Sogang University. And so he's 4, but has like this haircut that a lot of 20-something-year-old Korean students are having. So, it's those moments where, we talk a lot about windows and mirrors in children's literature. And so my good friend, colleague, Sarah Park Dallin, who's Korean American, non-adopted, has written a lot about this and the importance of windows and mirrors and what that looks like, right? And so, he's having access to all of these. How is that going to inform his identity in ways that, may have been similar, but obviously being in Korea, it's different, right?
Yeah.
Than if he was back home in the US.
Well, and not to start a whole new podcast episode, but especially the interplay of being in Korea with Koreans versus being in America with Korean Americans, and how that a bro haircut might look the same, but everything else might be very different, and yeah, I think that's so fascinating. And I love to hear the idea of fantasy and the mundane coming together in one thing, right? And I think we talked about this on our first episode. We might have touched on it just briefly around the idea of mythology and the role that it plays in the stories that we tell ourselves as adoptees, and how then we relate to the world around us because of the mythologies of our adoption, right? And so being able to think, I think, not that they're not wholly connected or unconnected, but the idea of we have, the mythology of our adoption, and we also have the fantasies and the dreams, and what is the interplay of those things as we move through the world and do very mundane things. And I think, I love where your head is at right now. And I really hope that becomes a viable thing to be put out into the world, whether it's in book form or otherwise. Honestly, if it only go so far as this podcast. It's enough to just like sit and chew on for me. So thank you so much for coming on the show across the international date line, I think. And
yeah, it's tomorrow there. So,
yeah,
it is tomorrow there.
It is
here.
the future.
Yeah, where can people find you? Where can people buy your book? How can people get connected and do things to help support your work?
You can find me on Instagram at Adoptee Killjoy. I'm also on Threads, but I am not very active. So KJ, when you were on there, I was like, oh, wait, I have to jump back on Threads. I'm also on Blue Sky, but I haven't really used it yet either as Adoptee Killjoy.
Yeah, I'm technically there, but I don't know.
Right. So I guess this is my very long way of saying you can find me on Instagram. And then there's a link in my bio there, a link tree where you can find information about ordering the book. You can order the book, Adoption Fantasies, The Fetishization of Asian Adoptees from Girlhood to Womanhood, wherever books are sold.
Is there an audiobook version? That's important.
I would have to double check. I think there should.
If there's not, we should figure out how to make that happen.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it as well. And appreciate again coming on our show again, first official, second time. So.
Well, thank you again so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Well, we have loved having you on. So you can follow her on Instagram. What was your handle one more time?
Adoptee Killjoy.
Adoptee Killjoy on Instagram. Hit the link in the bio to buy the book wherever books are sold. You can find us at Janchi Show. I'm at KJ Roelke. He's N Nowak or Nathan Nowak on Facebook. Patrick is at Patrick in the World. Support the show by going to janchishow.com/support. And that covers most of it, I think. We're not doing a food, right? We didn't coordinate that. Okay, great.
You did not send me a Korean food while I'm in Korea. No.
While you're in Korea. Hey, Kim, you know what? That's a two-way street.
Next time I'll just send you some hot dogs, knowing now that you...
Right? Well, no, yeah, I know. My son, he really misses a good American hot dog. I don't know where he gets that from because it's not from me.
That's really funny. Well, hey, until next time, Kim, thank you so much for coming on the show. Listeners, Janchi Heyo!